Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war. Because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans. Now, an army is a team. It lives, eats, sleeps, fights as a team. This individuality stuff is a bunch of crap. The bilious bastards who wrote that stuff about individuality for the Saturday Evening Post don't know anything more about real battle than they do about fornicating.
That was a speech from the movie Patton. It was about the General George Patton, a World War II general. He had a lot of success. He was a huge inspiration to troops. And when these speeches would come across back to America from Europe, it gave Americans confidence that we were doing the right thing. However, Patton's leadership style did limit him. Even though he was an inspiration and had a lot of easily tracked success, there was only so far he could go with his style. He thought he deserved bigger and better. He thought he deserved to have larger commands. So what happened? Well, we're going to explore that as we explore his style, which is known as the authoritative or autocratic leadership style. And we're going to see how that may or may not fit your organization on this next episode of Wright Insights.
Welcome to another episode of Wright Insights, the podcast that leads you to less stress and more success. Here's your host, Paul Bright.
Hi, welcome back to Wright Insights. I'm your host, Paul Bright. If you want to learn more about me, the crazy educational and life experiences paths that led me to this podcast, you can always go to brightinsightsmedia.com and check out my About page. Continuing on with this leadership series, the last episode I discussed how it's very hard to lead without having a clear and concise vision. If you don't have that in front of you, people are going to get lost along the way. And if they get lost, you're going to get lost. And now I want to talk about the different leadership styles that take people to this vision. And we're going to start with authoritative leadership. And I used Patton because in American history, he is often seen as a war hero who had a very distinctive style and just this uncanny bravado. I mean, he was the first to command an American expeditionary tank force back in World War I. When they switched from horses to tanks, he was in charge, and he didn't just master these tanks in practice. He didn't master these in exercises and drills. He drove those tanks and all the units behind them all through key battles in Germany and just developed this reputation amongst his enemies because he didn't just advance through, he destroyed and decimated the towns that he came through. And anytime his units were on the ground or there was a rumor that they were on the ground, the Germans, the Italians, they just had to know exactly where. It was a healthy respect and probably in some cases fear of Patton. And why did this happen? It was because Patton was known for rehabilitating units that had underperforming soldiers and low morale. He could come in and get these guys back to par. You know, war is tough, especially in those days when you get drafted, so you don't really have a choice. You're fighting for America. The information you have is limited. You're on a boat, you're on a plane, you're overseas in an entire other continent. And over time, they can wear you down. And Patton could come in there and whip these units back into shape. And he did it by setting these very, very, very high standards. If you made the smallest mistake, Patton would chew you up and down. But at the same time, if you excelled, if you exceeded above and beyond, if you showed that you were committed to him and the mission, very 110% committed, like he could highlight you and say, this is a real soldier here. Everybody needs to be like this guy. And once it came time to battle, He was up front. He wasn't like how you're supposed to do it in the military, where if you're a leader and you're out in the field, you're supposed to kind of be in the back. You don't want the enemy to know that you're the leader. That's why you don't salute people when you're out in the battlefield, because then they would knock off the leader and that would always take down morale. Patton did things kind of opposite. He liked to shine. He liked to have a shiny sidearm pistol with an ivory handle. He liked to hold a riding crop and have his boots spiked. He liked having the star on his tank so everybody knew that that was the general. He even wanted to paint it to where it stood out even more. He would write it out front, and the military was like, no, it's just too far breaking protocols. But that was just how he was. He believed that if the troops saw him in the middle of that fight, that they would fight even harder. He was just that kind of general. He commanded the 3rd U.S. Army throughout World War II, fought the Germans out of France with that assaultive style. But there was a problem. There's a problem with that. And we'll get into how his style was good and great, but limiting in a bit. So what I want to do is I want to talk about the authoritative or autocratic leadership style and some of the characteristics that are attached to them, right? So the first thing is that people that lead in this style are often actually very good experts in their field that they're leading. They're sometimes seen as the number one authority, the best realtor in town, the number one plumber here, the top IT guy that you go to. The authoritative leader is the guy that's known for being the expert, top to bottom. They're very charismatic. They're very communicative of what their needs are. Very decisive in nature. That guy or that lady walks in the room, all eyes are on that person. They don't hold back on what it is that they need, what they expect to be done. And you give them 2 choices. They've already made the choice before the second one's come out of your mouth. They're the head of all decisions and the outright influence on all decisions. And I'm not talking about some decisions. I'm talking about all decisions. If a decision has to be made, a purchase has to be made, an order needs to be made, it goes through them. Not necessarily people they delegate, but it goes through them. It takes a while for authoritative leaders to delegate. But all the decisions go through them. They're the ones who create all the policies. And all the expertise. They're the ones that create all the policies for just about everything in that work center. Whatever they're in charge of, they've got a policy for it. Everything has a policy. There's a rule for it all. And part of this is the assumption for authoritative leaders is that employees don't really want to work. They don't. If someone could come in, punch a clock in, not do anything for 8 hours, punch the clock out, and get paid, that's what they would do. So what authoritative leaders, the theory is that since employees don't really want to work, these leaders have to take charge to make them work. So they prefer reward and punishment systems as the influence. It's pretty clear. You do this thing here, you do X of these things, you get this reward. If you make this mistake or that mistake, you get this punishment. If you do this 3 times wrong, you get fired. If you do this 3 times right, you get a promotion, you get a cash bonus. That's how they set the structure. And having that rigid structure in place, it does make it a little bit easier on them to say, well, what did we say the rules were? There's a rule for that. What do we say it is? That's what the rule is. That's what's going to happen. And even in places where there's a board of directors, or even in nonprofits, even in churches, which I've personally experienced, it doesn't really matter who the influences are there. It doesn't matter who the subordinates are. If there's a board of some sort that can vote you out, they still have a my way or the highway attitude. It may not be boisterous. It may be undercover. It may be subtle. It may be passive aggressive. But they don't really listen to subordinates or colleagues or even people that are seen as above them. It's still my way or the highway because they're authoritative. And it's just, some of it can be attributed to just saying like a passion for the mission, a passion for the cause. Because of this, because of that charismatic nature, when this person walks in the room or they're in the work center, production can be higher. If you know that boss is going to be here for a week, walking through every section, production gets higher with their presence. But when they're gone, it can be average or even below average without them there. and then they come back and things go way high again. And then they're gone and it gets average or below average. Everything depends on that authoritative leader's strengths, because the decisions can't be made without him or her there. So how did these type of characteristics limit this great General Patton that the enemy was afraid of? Well, again, in the military, you have a rank system. Doesn't matter. It's not supposed to matter what you believe if there's somebody above you in rank that can make a bigger decision, or if they're in a position. If you could be, let's say, enlisted ranks go E1 through E9, officer ranks go anywhere from E01 to gosh knows how far generals go with stars. And if you are a captain and you come to the front gate of an Air Force base and you don't have your ID, the guy at that gate, even if he's an E2, can legitimately not let you in because you don't have the proper identification. Even though you as a captain outrank him, he's in the position that gives him authority not to let you in. And you can't really argue with that because you didn't have your ID. In other times where someone like Patton might be a 1-star general where he's in charge of a lot of people, if there's a 2-star general that's above him, well, he's above him. Even if that 2-star general hasn't been in as long, he still outranks him. And these 2 stars may even have different types of experiences, or 3 stars, than Patton did. But they still outranked him. They had a different type of mindset, different type of working strategy. And he often didn't listen to those guys, he would just plan things the way he felt like they needed to be done, especially when they were working. However, when you go from commanding units on the ground to commanding, overall commanding different units and battalions throughout a country or a continent, you have to have a different type of style because now you're working hand in hand with allies. Now you have a diplomatic style that you need to engage in. And Patton just wasn't about that. His characteristics didn't lend to that. He really just wasn't about patience when it came to dealing with the enemy or people not necessarily performing at the level he thought that they needed to perform at. So one thing that happened, right, was he was visiting a medical unit to give these troops a morale boost because, they were shot, they were hurt. He really had a heart for his troops, especially the ones that got wounded because they were in battle. And he came across a private that was pulled from the front lines because his nerves got to him. He was shaking. He just couldn't see himself going out through the fight. And Patton saw that as just absolutely weak. They called it battle fatigue back then. Likely would be called PTSD today. And he called him a coward and slapped him in front of everyone. He did this twice, actually, to 2 different people. And he even ordered other generals to discipline any soldiers who didn't fight because they just didn't have the nerves to do it. And so what's really interesting in this situation is that a lot of times the communication of what happens overseas, coming back to America back in these days, was very limited. It's usually like these short little 5-minute film reels added on top of movies. You might hear a blurb here and there on the radio, unless it was something very decisive like America has taken over Italy, or America has controlled France. You don't really hear too many specifics back then unless you saw them in those type of reels. But this actually got out to America. Some reporters found out about it, and even Eisenhower at the time was trying to keep it under wraps, but it still got out. And it forced him to force Patton to apologize to his soldiers and those who witnessed what happened. He just blamed it, that because of these incidences, that's why he didn't get a chance to command the First Army, and he lost that command to Omar Bradley, who was actually lower ranking than him and less experienced, which again goes counter to what I just said about how rank and experience tend to make you above people. But that's just, Patton's style was just not going to fit what was needed to command the First Army. So they picked Omar Bradley instead. There were a lot of incidences of insubordination by the way he spoke to higher authorities. And there was controversial statements he made throughout the rest of the war and even after the war. And, it led to other lost opportunities. He could have commanded the Pacific Command. And even at one point, he wasn't allowed to command anything for almost a year. So, in short, General Patton had a lot of great accomplishments, but his style limited him into being able to accomplish more. So, could what happened to Patton happen to you? If you were somebody who grew up playing a lot of sports and had a lot of tough coaches, or maybe you grew up in a military style of household because you were military dependent like me. And I'm not saying every military dependent grew up this way, but if that order and discipline just carried through your childhood, through your young adulthood, and now you're taking that same style and you're leading your own business or nonprofit or even, again, a church, could what happened to Patton happen to you? And I'm going to tell you this, and some people may not believe this, but I think that the authoritative style or authoritarian style can be good for a short period of time. Maybe you've taken over a business and feel like that wheeling that sword around will get things done back in order. And you might be right, because it's often this type of style that is credited for turning things around in a sinking operation. I mean, if the morale is low somewhere because it's been a bad environment, there's been no inspiration, an authoritative leader can come in there and stir the pot. Again, you see it in sports. You see it in some of with service in some of the places where it goes under new management. If you're a big fan of Gordon Ramsay, whether he's doing Hell's Kitchen or, some sort of restaurant disaster rehab, and you'll see he comes in there and he tells them what they need to do, and he starts yelling and throwing stuff around and donkey, all that, just calling him names. But then afterwards he explains what he's doing. And I don't imagine that he's like that at his restaurants, at his own restaurants. He does that a little bit for TV, but at the same time, it's often in these places or with people who have lost inspiration and lost some sort of drive or discipline. And it works for a little while. But what if you want long-term success and that's your style? Because Patton wanted to lead bigger commands than what he was leading, and he didn't get to do that because of his style. So there's some things you do need to consider, right? If you want the production quality to be high all the time, not just when you're there, but high all the time, you need to trust and develop at least one other person to be very much like you to make sure it stays that way. At least one other person. One person that you have to take under your wing that wants to be under your wing and is going to do pretty much what you do. They're going to be your number two, okay? You have to do that because they're going to be there and when you're not, and that production will stay high for a little while. And here's the thing. If you know that you're being hard on your folks, if you know that and you say, well, this is how it works, you can even play good cop, bad cop. You can have that guy pay attention to things and say, listen, I'm really, really hard on them. You do what you do, but I still expect these standards to be met. You got to train somebody up that way. You got to give it to them. All right. I just remember a long time ago watching Bill Parcells, the coach of the New York Giants. He was a former coach of the New York Giants, and he had a quarterback, Phil Simms, who's, he's an NFL announcer now. But I remember watching this interview of Phil Simms talking about his days at Parcells, and Parcells was really hard on his people. And he said one day, he brought Phil into the room and says, Phil, I love you. You're one of the best quarterbacks, I'm paraphrasing, that I've ever had. You're really hard work. He goes, but I'm really, really, really going to get at you today because I want these guys to rally around you. And Phil said, okay. And he said, at next practice, there was nothing Phil could do right. And he just got at Phil. And the players just played really, really hard because they wanted to protect their quarterback. They did better so that it wouldn't like Phil was going to make any more mistakes. Like, dang, coach is really getting at you, and Phil took it, led him to a championship. So, it worked for that short term. And so sometimes having that second person around to make sure things get done and letting them be the good guy, so to speak, can be helpful. You have to give a little ground there, right? They have to be able to provide that discipline and the rewards when you're not there. The second thing you have to do is not be afraid to show your heart. Again, if you know you're a tough cookie and this has been working, but you want to work more long term, and you'll know this because you'll start seeing really good people leave your organization. You'll start seeing your talent look elsewhere after a while, even though they're getting paid well and they're success, they're number one on the team or whatever. You'll start seeing them, head for the doors. You can't really stop them. Sometimes you got to show your heart and show them why you do what you do. Even Patton was so sweet to his wife, and he wrote so many letters about his men and how much he loved and cared about them. He just really, really, really cared about his soldiers a lot. And I think that he did show it, and that's why they were able to keep fighting for him. I had a couple of experiences like that. One about people leaving an organization, and another one about people working harder under two authoritarian types. Right. The first one was, the one where people were working harder because the guy showed his heart. I used to work in a factory somewhere in North Carolina, and I worked there for about 6 months. I took a semester off of school. My family needed a little bit of extra help at home, and I was like, all right, let me just go do whatever. And I had a relative that was working at a factory. She got me the job, and I went in there, and you really were just folding up these like material bags, at least my job, over and over and over and over again. You just had to have so many folded per hour. And there was a guy there that just cracked the whip. He was just not rude, but he was, what are you doing? You're not doing it right. I mean, over and over and over again. If you're 1 minute late, if you're 15 minutes late, I'm going to dock you an hour. So he needed people there on time. If you were in the restroom too long, he's like, don't make me fire you. That was the way he talked, but the standards were there. The rules were there. You knew what you had to do. And so we worked at it. And I mean, there was a couple of meetings where he called where people were talking junk, and he straight out was like, if you guys are going to gossip, you can just leave. Like, we don't know who said what. But one day he had a special, I think it was Christmas, and we were all having lunch. He had a potluck and everything. He never really spoke personally to many people. But he brought his family in, and he was an older guy, but he had this little kid who was like 8 years old. And he said, everybody, this is my son. He goes, this is why I do what I do. And he just loved on that son the whole time. He wouldn't let that kid's hand go. He was all babying him. We're like, what a nice dude. He really cares about his family, And we started learning more and more about him and his family and how much he actually cared about the workers. We ended up getting some pretty good bonuses that year. He was authoritative, but he showed his heart. And so people did want to work a little bit harder, work a little bit longer for him. Now, the example of where I saw it go wrong was when I was working for a nonprofit. And we were often tasked to work with other nonprofits in the area. You go around, I'm working with a special population that needs some mental health help, some placement. And you work with other organizations, even if they were seen maybe as competitors, because a lot of these nonprofits are funded with government money. You could often bid on the same projects, and sometimes you win the bid, sometimes you lose the bids. And it didn't matter to us. We're like, whatever. We're all here for the same cause. And there was one nonprofit that it was rumored that the person that was running it was very, very much an expert in that person's field, but not the nicest of people. And the first 5 or 6 times I ran into that person, not a problem. Very cordial, had these nice conversations. And then one day I walked in and just looking around, looking for somebody. And that person came out in the middle of everybody and just started chewing me up and down. You're taking up my office space. You don't pay rent here. You're just coming here to meet with clients, and you have an office way over here and your fancy badge. And, oh, look at your organization. You have all this money. And like, there were witnesses. It wasn't just like a one-on-one. I said, do you want to talk about this out back? We're not having a talk about this out back. I don't want you coming in here anymore with that fancy badge in your organization. And I was like, all right. So I was out. And one of the people that's working there was like the number 2. And saw what had happened and didn't jump into my defense or anything like that. And that kind of miffed me. I was like, this isn't true. we had our own office. It was down the street. But our corporate office was way, way further. And I guess this person didn't realize we had a satellite office. So I saw that person later on. It's like, oh yeah, you're not the first person to take that. You're probably like the 20th person to take that. And I didn't want to say nothing at the time because I wasn't planning on staying. And so it was cool. And then I would say within a year, the number 2 left. And then the number 3 left. And then the number 4 left. And all these people left. And half of them ended up coming to our organization. And this person was looked at as a very big expert and very compassionate in some ways about the population we were serving. But just insecure. Just didn't like what we had to offer because we were better funded. And that person wielded this type of authority around to where even the board of directors was afraid to fire because they were still getting money based on some of the results. But eventually it started to catch up. It really started to catch up. When your staff leaves you to come work with another staff and they're getting paid well and they're having success, but they feel the freedom, that's what can happen with somebody who is in too much of an authoritative leadership style and applying too much discipline and too much heavy fire when it's no longer needed. So keep that in mind. If you are an authoritative leader, if you are an autocrat, it may not necessarily be a bad thing from where you started, but it may not be the style you want to carry on when you want to finish higher and at a bigger level. So learn to adjust, and you may have a lot less stress and more success in your organization. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Bright Insights. For more information on how to have less stress and more success, visit brightinsightsmedia.com.